Welcome to Radicalized 506, an anti-racism podcast brought to you by the Saint John Newcomers Center. My name is Bob Whitney, and I will be your moderator. Our goal is to share the message of anti-racism through sharing the stories of newcomers in our city, giving voices to those who are looking for the chance to speak. It is important to welcome newcomers to our community and any person, minority from the community to hear their stories and challenges to raise awareness for anti-racism in order to create an accepting society. We will be joined by three guests who are going to share their experience and lead our discussion. Amanda Leblanc is a Waskabi woman and member of the Woodstock First Nation. With over 10 years experience in the nonprofit sector, she has experience working with health charities, community organizations, as well as working in the private sector. She comes from a long line of advocates and has been involved in Aboriginal Indigenous advocacy since a youth, through volunteering and board positions with an emphasis on off-reserve and Indigenous rights issues. Matthew Martin, born and raised in Saint John, New Brunswick, and current EB for Black Lives Matter, New Brunswick. Maryam Nasser is a Palestinian Egyptian Canadian who moved to Saint John in 2013 to complete a Bachelor of Science in Financial Mathematics from UNB Saint John. She currently works as a Community Engagement Coordinator at Crescent Valley Resource Center. Over the past several years, she has helped newcomers navigate systems and services to facilitate their resettlement and integration into their new home.
I doubt that anyone who's participating and listening tonight is unaware of the major challenges of racism, so I don't think we should or need to spend a lot of time talking about that. But I'd just like to make a couple of points to get things started. And that would be number one, that when we're talking about racism, we're talking about several things that are very clear. One of them is dehumanization. Racism is about dehumanizing other people, and it's about silencing them and marginalizing them from any kind of discussion about how we should control our lives or organize our lives. So fundamentally, racism is about dehumanization at one very basic level. It's also, of course, about inequality. We live in a society and we live in a world where there are lots of problems, of course, with inequality. And inequality is justified in many different ways. But one of the ways that it's justified is through racism and to deny people equality and equal rights and dignity by once again dehumanizing them. So racism is a fundamental part about maintaining inequalities in our society. And the other thing that I think is important is to, and hopefully we can spend some time talking about this tonight, is that one of the issues, of course, or key parts of racism is to talk about not only racism at a personal level, which of course it is. It's profoundly personal and profoundly hurtful. And people have to, once again, confront it in many different ways at a personal level. But also to talk about what we mean by systemic racism or structural racism, where we can see that racism exists in all of the institutions that we are a part of, whether they're work or community or school. And that when we talk about institutions, when we talk about the social structures we live in on a day-to-day basis in society, social structures are usually about power. Some people have more power than others. And sometimes that can be very evident what that power is, and sometimes it isn't. But once again, one of the ways that racism manifests itself is through the kind of habitual daily structures of power that can inhibit or be part of the places we work, the places we study, in our community organizations, in the street, wherever we go. And that sometimes can be a little bit harder to get a handle on because we might not be confronted with individual aggressive racism. but we see it once again in the day-to-day power relationships that we are all dealing with. And so part of the challenge is to be able to identify that when we see it and experience it, and be able to call it out and be able to challenge that when it's there. So whichever community we're part of, I think part of the purpose of these public discussions is to share our knowledge and experience about how racism at different levels, individual, structural, social, institutional, how that plays out in our lives, and how that plays out in different communities, whether it's in Indigenous communities, whether it's within newcomers communities, whether it's within the Black communities. You know, we need to be able to hopefully share information, knowledge, and hopefully strategies about how we can deal with that, not only within our communities, but hopefully in solidarity with each other, so that we can present a kind of united front when necessary, when we're confronted with the common problem of racism. So the purpose really of this is to be able, this discussion is to be able to do that. And to get things started, I think what might be useful to hear from all of our panelists is sort of why we are here as panelists, basically. But the reality, I think, is that, you know, we're people who are involved in one way or the other in our communities, and maybe the people listening in would like to know a little bit more about how we got to the point where we are here tonight, where we're actually talking about it. So I'll just begin with myself and then ask the other people to say a few words about how they started getting involved in these issues. And for me, it's really simple. It's basically part of my family was a family that has been deeply affected by war and conflict over several generations. And as a result of that, my family and myself and the people around me have been people who have been very consistent about opposing war and therefore racism, because racism is part of colonialism. And that became something that was very much part of my family ever since my grandparents. So in one sense, not quite a joking matter, it's almost a genetic problem. I can't help but be part of these kinds of concerns and issues and do whatever I can do to challenge them. So that's the reason that I'm part of this kind of discussion, because I think it is an obligation for all of us to speak up and do what we can when we can. So that's really the basic point why I'm here. And then perhaps I'd like to just ask some of the other people who are talking, perhaps Maryam, how did you get here? How did you participate in this?
Thanks, Bob. Briefly, I am a Palestinian Egyptian, but just to kind of put it in perspective, my ancestry is Palestinian Egyptian, and I definitely believe that I am. However, I was never been in Palestine. I was born in Kuwait, lived there for 10 years of my life, then moved to the UAE, lived there for another 8 years before moving to Canada. And then we came here as immigrants to get the Canadian citizenship, and I recently did a couple of years ago. And growing up, I had a little bit of identity crisis. What does having a voice mean? What does having an identity mean? What does it mean to live in a place and not be able to call it home, which is the case in the Gulf, the Arabic countries. Unfortunately, that's most of it. Yes, I was born in Kuwait. My mom was born in Kuwait. All my aunts and uncles were born in Kuwait, yet Kuwait is not my home. So when I moved to Canada and I realized, well, there's something called freedom of speech. I can say my opinion and I can defend the causes that it means so much to me, especially being a Palestinian, forbidden. My entire life has been forbidden from entering my own home country for a conflict, and racism is a huge part of it. I decided that enough is enough. Now that I have a voice, it's almost my responsibility to use it wisely and to make sure that all the conflicts and all of the injustice that I see in the world, it's my responsibility to speak up and to say something. And honestly, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to lie. When I moved to Saint John, it was not easy. As simple as going on the bus and being the only person on that bus wearing the scarf representing my identity as a Muslim, and people being fearful to even sit next to me and speak to me, or even assume that I do not speak the language. That really hurts on some level. It hurts that you are judged just based on how you look. People are not giving you the benefit of the doubt to even interact with you and see who you are as a person before judging you. So with the Syrian crisis and many people started moving here, I found there was a shift. People were realizing, oh, there are so many people that we can talk to, and some of them are nice, some of them are bad. However, slowly too, we're shifting into the us versus them mentality. And that's why I wanna eliminate that. I wanna be part of the solution of removing us versus them, because at the end of the day, we're all made out of the same. I genuinely believe we're all the same race. We're the human race. It doesn't matter what color, what orientation, what background you have. We all have the same feelings. We're all the same people on the inside. It doesn't matter. We might have different goals, different ambitions in life, but we're the same. So we should not let our differences in appearance or from the outside set how we interact with each other. And we should stop having that, we need to put everybody in a box and go with it. We should let the people kind of narrate their story and go from there. Sorry, I can ramble a lot about that topic. So to allow for others to speak, maybe I would pass the ball to either Matt or to Amanda to tell you guys why they're part of this journey.
And Matt.
Sure. Amanda, why don't you go?
Okay. So Kwe Nildali with Amanda. My name is Amanda. I just want to thank the organizers for reaching out to a friend who then referred me to do this. So as mentioned, I am Willistakwe, a member of the Woodstock First Nation, but I've actually never lived there. So I also grew up just outside of Saint John. I'm in Grand Bay. Just recently moved back, actually. Really happy to be back home. Just from Wellsford. It's not like I came far, but still it's home. And yeah, so I grew up off reserve, which is kind of why that's always been a point of interest for me, because my family obviously had a very different experience than their family members who were able to grow up within community, and Woodstock being so far from Saint John. So you can imagine what comes with that beyond the loss of connection in the community, loss of language, all kinds of things. So as mentioned, I've been active since my youth, but I kind of grew up with it since day one. I remember my dad, my aunts bringing me to meetings and political meetings and hearing that talk all the time about what's right and our rights and recognition of rights. So in my 20s, because same as Maryam, I suffered very much from an identity crisis growing up. So as early as grade 2, being corrected by the grade 2 teacher, when I tried to correct her to say, no, the Mekmak aren't the only ones who hunt. We hunt too. We don't just gather and grow, as the book just said, and being sent to the principal's office, starting from a very young age, believing that what we were doing at home and how we lived at home was wrong and in some way not what was supposed to happen. So it wasn't until after I left school that I really started getting engaged on more of a personal level, not just through my dad and my extended family, and seeing what that was. So I joined an organization, the New Brunswick Aboriginal People's Council, which actually started in the 70s, and my grandmother was one of the first organizing people of that. And it started out of sexual discrimination along with racial discrimination, on how Indigenous women lost their quote status when they married a non-status man, not necessarily a non-Indigenous man, but a non-status man. And that's why people were forced from their homes within community. So having family who's participated in the constitutional acts of 85, like it's very well ingrained in me. So as I started to learn that and realize the injustices and understanding why our family was the way it was, and hearing about residential school as an adult and all of these things, just really put a lot of pieces into place, I guess, for me, in terms of how, why some things were the way they were in our family, and just really not being okay with that. And as Maryam, again, I feel like we have a lot in common. Just when you find your voice, you feel like you have a responsibility to then not just educate, but to learn more. So a lot of it, although people say I should be a lawyer. Maybe it's because I like to fight, or I don't know. But I feel like the most important thing to do is learn and listen, and to really know who it is you're talking to and how you can educate them best. So through that organization, I was a youth director. I then moved on, was vice chief for about 6 years. And then most recently, I just have a new baby. He's about 15 months. But before that, I was the interim president and chief of the New Brunswick Aboriginal People's Council. So I was working on negotiations for fishing rights and access to economic development, like literally everything. I'm a very quick learner, thank goodness. Learning about LFAs and all these fishing terms, which definitely helps in understanding what's happening in Nova Scotia these days. It was at a necessity, but it was really there where I really felt an obligation. I had a great team of mentors around me and surrounding me with some really intelligent people. And I found that people listened to me. So putting those two together, having great resources to pull from and putting together a message that people want to hear and will respond to, I really enjoyed, and I found. So again, that's kind of, it's a calling. It feels like a calling. It was not something, not somewhere I thought I'd be 10 years ago, that's for sure. But definitely, I have that sense of urgency that things need to happen, and I just want to do my small little part to educate anybody who wants to learn.
Thank you. Matt.
Yeah, so growing up in Saint John, I'm a biracial son of my black mom and my white dad. So growing up, I was really, I'd say, whitewashed. I never learned anything about my Black history. And growing up, I played a lot of sports and stuff. And like, you know, I'd be playing sports, I'd be called the N-word. You know, I faced some racism when I was growing up in school. Just at the time, I thought it was just these teachers don't like me. And sitting here today, over the last few months, when I've looked over like my past, I've started to realize like, it wasn't that those teachers just didn't like me. I believe they had a racial bias at this point when I think back. So growing up, in my family that my dad took the lead in, I was never taught any of my history, of my Black history. So when the slaying of George Floyd happened, and there was all these uprisings across the globe, here in Saint John, the same thing was happening. And I said, you know, I really want to get involved with this. I think it's enough time of just being passive to racism and not standing up for myself and just laughing it off and taking it was nothing, and that it was time to start standing up and having respect for myself and for who I am as a man today. So as everything unfolded, I got involved. And slowly that involvement became less of an involvement and more of a leadership role here in Saint John. And as that grew, I heard stories from people in organizations that you would think that there wouldn't be racism there with how big they are. And hearing stories from just so many people, and then realizing like, wow, like my own Black history, I never learned because my father didn't want to teach it to me. So much like Marianne and Amanda, like there was that need for, I guess, a thirst for knowledge to learn more about my Black history. And then the more and more I learned, the more I learned that it's not being taught. It's something you really have to go digging and fighting for just to hear stories or even just look for anything. And I know we're in a digital age where you can find everything, but it's even still very blank, and there's a lot of missing pieces. So moving forward, I said, you know, I want to be involved. I want to help my Black community be equal. Even to this day, people ask me like, you know, you might not face racism today. And my job, I wear suits every day. I work 6 days a week, and I am in a suit in the Uptown area. And I can be walking through the Uptown area, and I will have people get on an elevator with me. And before COVID, because now it's normal to separate in the elevator, but before COVID, I would get on an elevator with a lady, and she would literally like look at me and clench her purse and pretty much stand on the ceiling if she could. And at first I just thought, wow, this is funny. Like people think like I'm this terrible person. And then, you know, it kind of dawns on you that no, people think because I'm Black, I'm going to rob you. People think because I work in the jewelry industry. So my fiance has some jewelry, just perks of the job. But when people look at it, they go, oh, he's got to be a drug dealer. And these are just racial biases that are passed on to me because I am a Black man who is, I'd say I'm somewhat successful in my work field. And if that's just me, what is everybody else going through who are very successful Black men? And I think it just got to a point when I said, you know, enough's enough. I'm not going to stand by and let people push me around, treat me differently, say no to whatever it may be purely because of a racial bias or their opinion of me based on my skin color. So with that, I began to push more and more with our community. Even to this day, within the Saint John community, I'm having meetings every day with different city officials to push for equality, not only for our Black community, but for any visible minority or any individual of color. So yeah, that's kind of how I got involved.
Okay. Thank you. A question that might be worth all of us talking about, and then maybe also hearing from people who are listening in, is that I think one of the things that we know about history generally is how, and Matt just said this wonderfully, is about how, and Amanda too, how history is silenced, how the history of people, their lives, their culture, their struggles, their contributions hasn't been taught, hasn't been told, hasn't been valued, whether in school or day to day. And that's part of racism, that intentional institutional silencing of people and their histories and their voices. So on the one hand, I think when we know about Saint John in this area, we know that there have been many people over the decades who have, and centuries in fact, who have resisted that, certainly Indigenous peoples. So the resistance to that is not new. But on the other hand, it might be safe to say, and I'd be interested in hearing what you folks have to say, that, you know, perhaps the kind of discussion that we're having tonight might not have happened 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even though there were people resisting racism in their own way. So it's not like they weren't there. This kind of discussion might not have happened then. There would have been perhaps all kinds of reasons why people wouldn't participate or wouldn't initiate it. I can remember that there were attempts 15 or 20 years ago to start things about racism, and they just never got off the ground. Hopefully something now, and I think things have got off the ground with certainly Black Lives Matter and other groups that are now organizing. But my question is, what do you folks think about what has changed in recent years where people are organizing, are talking about it more, are not remaining silent, and as Matt said, you know, being marginalized or just, you know, dismissed or overtly treated in a racist way, but are now fighting back, resisting, speaking back in their own ways? What's changed in the last couple of years that we're doing this more?
I think I'd like to talk. I'll grab the mic on this one. I think right now, I think it was just a perfect mixture right now. Over the last 10 years, there's a quote by Will Smith that racism's always been around. It's just now people are filming it. I think that also mixed with COVID, where we're at with COVID now, people didn't have anything to do but to look at what they're seeing on their tablets, their computers, their phones, and realize this is happening. We're in a digital age now. So 10 years ago, you know, Prude has been, you know, going to schools and speaking about cultural diversity for generations. And, you know, I've heard how, you know, it was a struggle for them to speak about racism. But now, because of this digital age where people now see racism is happening, you know, the death of George Floyd, with what's going on in Nova Scotia, everything is being filmed, and we have to sit and watch it. And to not acknowledge it at this point in time would just make you complicit to what you're seeing. So I think that's a big reason why is 10 years ago we might not have seen anything because people could easily deny it. Where today you can't easily as deny it because it's there on your phone for something for you to watch.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maryam, Amanda, either of you want to say something?
Yeah, so I think in the Indigenous community, I think what's a bit different from us is we actually have the treaties that actually predate Canada. But I think what's changed the conversation a lot, and I would go back a bit more, probably the last 30 years, is education. So now that Indigenous people are educating themselves, we have more Indigenous lawyers, people actually understanding the issues and using colonial laws against themselves. So we have some pretty big court wins. I feel like a lot of talk and chatter happens around there. Like I mentioned, the constitutional talks in the 80s, the 90s, that like it feels like every 10 years there's a major landmark decision. So there's a lot of talk around it, and then it just kind of dies. There's a lot of papers that are written. There's a lot of promises. So the calls to action, for example, TRC, like all of those things are really hyped up for a year or two, and then they just kind of die. But I think the difference is Indigenous people now, and Matt hit the nail right on the head, is we are now connected in a way that we've never been connected before. We have ability to call the troops and supports from across, for us, Turtle Island, and making sure that everybody knows what's happening, and not just for support, but learning from each other. So what are the Haida doing right in BC? How can we use those colonial tactics in their own courts to really have them recognize and respect the treaties? And here in the East Coast, our treaties are a lot different than those out West, which is why we struggle so much. But I think education has been the biggest piece. So people, although it is in front of them, a lot of the people are still choosing to not acknowledge it. And I agree with Matt. It's just, you're choosing racism and ignorance at that point. You really have no excuse now. And I've sadly experienced that in a very real way in the last week. But I think those who are choosing to pick up the gauntlet and really to hold the flame and be a beacon for everybody else to kind of come towards and learn from. So whether they're non-Indigenous or not a person of color, at least there's somebody they trust and be like, hey, I heard you talk about that. What's that actually mean? And there's conversations happening outside of our groups. But I think people are now, there's enough bridges that are built that we have allies. So those are I think some of the biggest changes too, is we have a lot more allies connected. So it's not that they weren't there before, but they're all connected. So it might have been a secret thing to support your Indian neighbor, but you would never admit that in a grocery store if you saw them there, right? That shame has kind of really gone away. And I think a lot of it comes from civil disobedience. So understanding our role and what democracy actually is, and how much power we actually have, and people recognizing that. We've seen that in the revolutions in the 60s and the 70s. I just watched that movie the other day on Netflix about the 7 in the States who were charged and got off about inciting the riots in Chicago. So I think the connectedness is definitely just helping us all help each other in a bit more strategic way. An advantage that governments and large systemic, I guess, changes, they've always been that connected, and they're very intentionally designed to keep us kind of suppressed. But now that we're aware of it, that's the thing. We are now educated to fight it from the inside, I guess, the man on the inside. We have more men and women on the inside, and we have more people on the inside who are the change makers and decision makers, I think, is the key difference. We have a lot more decision makers who are open-minded and realizing that sometimes their paradigms are not the reality of the people they represent. So them being open to learning the uncomfortable situations and the conversations that need to happen, but that we do have some really great people and allies in there. So, but yeah, short answer, I think the connectedness has really helped.
Yeah, thank you. Maryam.
I definitely agree with both Matt and Amanda. I can only speak for at least the group I can relate to, which is Arabs. Arabs have forever been colonized and have always gone through one regime over to the other, and we're kind of programmed to be not have a voice, to always obey and not argue or not question authority. You should just accept what's given to you and live with it peacefully. You should not have a voice. You should not argue why things are done in a certain way. I certainly never had a voice in the Middle East, in the sense that if something I did not like, I would likely get in trouble if I argued why, or raise my voice and say, no, I do not accept, I don't understand, or I do not accept the way you're treating me. So it has, that mentality still exists today, even with education, even with awareness. However, I find that most of us now that we are educated and we have seen other examples, a lot of people have sacrificed over the years, have worked really hard and even paid tremendous prices. They even have sacrificed their lives just because they spoke up to a specific regime or the opposition or whatever. We've learned that if they can succeed, we can succeed too. And it doesn't matter what price we pay at today. At some point, the next generation, our children, or the next 3 generations, maybe they will have a voice, and they will be able to excel and be able to get out of this racism or the structure that they're set in. And like you said, Amanda, a lot of us did not know how to use our voices, and how do we talk to people that are higher, that have higher education than us, sorry. And again, to your point, Matt, we can see it now. It doesn't mean that it wasn't happening. It was happening, but they were getting away with it because not many people were aware. Or it wasn't that easy for somebody in Saint John to find out what happened in Palestine. It's so easy to find this information. It's so easy to utilize that information and to use it for our benefit, for our cause. That it doesn't matter that something happened somewhere else, we can't even have a voice for it, because my neighbor next door might be from Lebanon, and there was a bombing last month, and maybe it's a good thing to check on them. And now that we're familiar with each other, their cause becomes mine. So that connectiveness definitely has helped all the causes out there, and made us more familiar with one another, and realize that our differences at the end of the day don't really matter.
Yes. I would just simply add that as someone who works at the university, I have learned that it's important that we shouldn't confuse having degrees and letters behind our name as meaning that we're educated. And I think being educated is a much more, in some ways, complex and nuanced process that has to do with our ability to make sure that what we learn is also applied in the real world and applied in our lives in terms of changing our lives, so that we're able to do that. So part of how these whole power games work is, as you were saying, Maryam, that people who supposedly have higher education keep telling us how to say things, what we should say, how we should say it, what we should learn, what we shouldn't learn. And that's part of the power game. And that is often very much used in racist ways. So that's another thing that, the whole institutionalization of knowledge and who monopolizes that is something that I think we also have to resist. What I'm wondering, though, is, speaking of having a voice, Lena, I don't know whether there are people who are listening who have questions or comments for any of our speakers.
Yeah, do you guys have any questions to any of the speakers? If you want to ask them about their journey, you want to ask them, oh, Mohammed, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so I actually have a question for the speakers and Bob as well. Like St. John right now in New Brunswick, we are growing. We are welcoming more newcomers to a community from all over the world with different backgrounds, with different ethnicities, different parts of the world. So diversity is growing, and with diversity, with growth comes challenges. So what is your worldview of how we can combat racism, and how we can make this as more of a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach?
I would simply say very quickly and then leave it to the others, and I know it's going to sound very simplistic, but it's education and organization. I think we need to educate ourselves constantly, and I think what we're doing today, we each do, I think every day is part of that, and the more conversations we can have like this, the better. So that's an important process, and I think that's why we're doing it. And the second thing is to turn this discussion into action, because if we get organized, which we're doing, as Amanda was saying, if we learn how to do that, and as Matt was saying, we use the social media, the techniques that we have now to get connected in ways. If we're not organized, then the politics of divide and conquer will move against us. We'll be spending time, fighting each other or arguing with each other instead of facing the common concerns and common problems that we have. So for me, learning from each other and educating ourselves and organizing are the two sort of key words that we need to do. What about others?
I feel like, and this is more for newcomers coming to, I guess, New Brunswick and Saint John in general, is having a resource, I think, making everybody aware of what their rights are coming into a city or a territory that they're not familiar with, because I think that's a lot of issue why people don't speak up, and especially like even Indigenous people coming from other parts of Canada and not being familiar with how different and behind New Brunswick is often, just making them aware of what things are available. So for example, if they were being harassed at work, just a simple example, that there are actually things in place to help them navigate that through like the labor board, for example. A lot of people don't even know that exists. So just having something like that, I think would help. Like I 100% agree with Bob, education is key for first and foremost and should be implemented at every single level, including all secondary. But I think a right now thing would just being equipping people with the tools, I guess, to defend themselves, because the reality is it's going to be a couple generations before we see any kind of ripple positive effect that's going to last. So how to help people right now is just making them aware of what their rights are and the avenues that are currently existing. And that'll also help identify what gaps are there. And that's where other organized groups and other initiatives can actually come out of. So once the issues are made public, that's usually when the solutions start coming too. So I think that might help.
I'd have to agree with Amanda, like fully. I think, education is great, but I think, like you said, it's going to be a while until, racism isn't a thing. But if we equip, our youth, their kids, and continue that and empower our communities to give them the tools that they need to defend themselves against racism, I think until racism isn't a thing that we're discussing, is a great place to start.
Not just educating the newcomers, but there's also an education that we need to do in our local community here, is that we also need, there are two different parts of racism that I am a newcomer myself. So when I face racism here, it's generally not very blunt racism, like somebody calling me a name. It has happened. But generally speaking, the racism that most of us face is the indirect racism, or the racism that somebody might think that they're not being racist to begin with. So there's a whole education piece that the local community needs to understand, that anybody that looks like me, they might be Muslim just because they wear the hijab, but they might not be exactly like me. So painting a brush that all newcomers come from the same socioeconomical background, the same educational background, or set the same expectation for them that within a certain time of period, you're going to come here, you're going to be just like us, you're going to dress like us, you're going to have your life exactly like we want you to be. That is not reasonable. We also need to educate our local community that our expectations need to be adjusted to see what the needs of the newcomers that are coming here, to know that they might on the outside look exactly the same, but the onside or their journey might be completely different. So even as nice of an action that somebody will see a newcomer in the supermarket and offer to pay for their groceries, that's a very sweet, nice thing to do for a newcomer. But also you're kind of assuming that they are unable to pay for their own goods. their own groceries. They might be born in Canada, live their entire life in Canada, just like everybody else, but it came from a good place. You can tell when somebody is being racist because they're evil, or they're being racist because they are genuinely don't think that they're being racist to you. So we need to do an education on both parts. How should newcomers interact with non-newcomers, and vice versa. So in order for them to mingle together, to become part of one big group, happy group, with no this versus that. Because this is unfortunately where we are right now, is there's always an assumption that just because you look different, you are a newcomer. After a certain time, a period, we want those newcomers to not be called newcomers. We want them to be part of our own community, right? So when we're still labeling them as the outsider, they're still gonna stay with that mentality that I'm the other. So I'm a little bit different. I should be treated differently. So we're also setting up for I don't wanna sound harsh, but we're kind of setting them up for failure if we're gonna keep that mentality within our community. So it's great in the beginning to just have kind of a little bit of an understanding what a newcomer looks like, or what kind of a newcomer, what their journey might be, but also give them the benefit of the doubt and let them narrate their story. Let them tell you what kind of a newcomer they are. Let them tell you whether they are a newcomer or not. So when I see you, Matt, for example, sorry, I'm gonna pick on you. I should not assume that you are not born and raised a Saint Johner. I should not have that assumption just because you have a different skin tone that you're not a local Saint Johner. Or when I see you, Amanda, sorry, I'm gonna pick on you again, that you're automatically white. I should give you the benefit of the doubt that you come, not benefit of the doubt, sorry, that I should let you tell me who you are and explain to me your journey and explain to me why you're here and who you are and all of that. And that's where I think we are a little bit lacking, is that we're easily assuming rather than asking. If there is one thing I want to do, is just create shirts that says, ask, don't assume. And just give it to everybody. It's way easier to just ask. I know a lot of people are afraid to be called racist by asking, but it's better to ask than to just assume and fall into the risk of being called a racist.
I would simply add that from my own direct experience, especially with friends and people that I've known from the Latin American community here in Saint John and elsewhere, that one of their challenges is that when they come from places where there's been an extreme, when they're often either refugees or immigrants, but they've come from places where there's been a great deal of repression, of war, of violence, of torture, then arriving in Canada is for them often a chance, they hope, to start life over again and to live in some kind of peace and security and to raise a family. And then what they often come across fairly soon is the problem of racism. But then the challenge is, once again, are they going to get into a political confrontation with a new government in a new society, with a new community, that on the one hand, they want peace and they want security because they've come from a place where those things were lacking. And now they're finding that challenges of racism are here. And having those people find their voice within that history that they've been through. And I can speak from experience in the Latin American case, but certainly I know people who come from other parts of the world, that gaining their voice here when they've come from that kind of background is not an easy thing for people to do. And that is, I think, one of the challenges as well that I think many newcomers face, that they have, for lack of a better term right now, a lot of baggage when they come here about political involvement, about speaking up, about the cost that that will have for them. They worry about things like, will this affect my citizenship? Will I lose my job? Will I lose my rent? Well, those kind of things are common. But I think newcomers often really sense those kinds of concerns. So somehow that particular situation needs to be addressed.
No, thank you so much. Is there anyone, I'm curious to know if anyone from the audience has any questions or even comment or experience something themselves or through whether a client or a partner, you know, whoever you deal with. I'm interested to hear. I see.
Yes, please. Thank you very much for organizing this virtual event. It's lovely to see everyone here. Yeah, speaking as a woman of color, Muslim with hijab, so I really noticed when we moved here that maybe I certainly agree that we all need education. It's not only newcomers who need education. Yes, we do, but maybe having other education to other community members about who other minorities are would be really fruitful. What I noticed is that from my experience in Saint John is that Saint Johners are very polite. They're always concerned they might offend you with their questions. So they rather not ask at all. While actually asking questions can open a conversation and we can get to know each other. I had situations where people saw me for the first time in a hallway, and it was actually, yeah, a male adult. And they kind of gave me the impression they'd rather hide in a locker than come across me. They were actually really afraid. So educating people of any other minorities would be of great benefit so that we have, certainly our similarities are way more than our differences, but we need to communicate. So having maybe such events and getting to know each other would be, from my understanding, I believe it would be of great benefit.
Anyone would like to comment, or anyone else has a question or comment?
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, I'm listening very well, and I'm a little white girl with two colored nieces who have definitely suffered under this regime. Anyways, this is my thought on this. I'm more of an activist than you know, putting the education on the table, but it seems to me that we're putting the people that are being discriminated against in the forefront, and this is a white man's problem, and because, you know, we're the racist, and there's no doubt about that in my mind, and I just think that this is we need to get a community of white people fighting this, and I feel very strongly about being more of an activist and going against, you know, the police and the RCMP, you know, because they're very cushy jobs for white supremacists. And so I myself want to belong to a group of some sort that is willing to get out there and, you know, put their well, not blood on the line, but speak up. I really, I think we've sat around long enough. This has been going on for hundreds of thousands of years, and you know, the people have stood up, and there's a lot of white people out there. So somehow I don't really know how to organize it, but I want a group of you know, white people who have this horrible problem to get up there and do some heavy work, some heavy lifting, as they might say. So that is my opinion. And just Amanda, who's a First Nations, I was so distressed about the lobster fishermen and what took place there, but I was more distressed that the RCMP stood around and just didn't seem to know what to do.
Yeah, so I'll very carefully touch on that. So I initially thought that too. That was like, well, why aren't they doing anything? And I'm following it quite closely. I have family down there, I have friends down there, but I don't want to assume. Because they might be directed by their boss. They might be doing their job that we don't know about. I don't agree that it's the best way of action at all. I don't agree that it was fair to have those two men lock themselves in a building and say the only way you're going to get out is to, I definitely think there's another layer, but I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt because I recognize the situation that they're in. There are a lot of good people in law enforcement. My sister and her husband are both two people of that, but
whatsoever to say, you know, you can come in here and you know, and be a person of color and can't get a job just because of you look at, and you can walk into the armed forces or the RCMP or the police officer just because you're going to go take a couple of courses and nobody bothers to see, you know, what your value system is. So, I am more of an activist, and that is the way I would like to go. Not that I don't believe in education, but I know there are highly educated people leading the white supremacist movements around this world, and so education doesn't hold much other than the fact that, yes, we need to get it out to the people in a heartier way. For myself, I would be using the digital aids. I would be, I don't know, getting it out there, subliminal messaging or something. I'm not, you know, it's not my thing. Anyways, that's my piece, and I am interested in joining a group of some sort. Thank you.
I have a question in the chat I can read, but if you have a comment, go ahead.
I know we're almost out of time, but I'd like to say a big thank you to all of those who are able to join us today, and as well as to Bob for coordinating this for us, and Lena for being the person, or tech person, and doing everything that putting this together. Maryam Nasser, Amanda Leblanc, and Matthew Martin, we couldn't have done without you. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your contributions. And this is a difficult conversation. So we have to have it, but it went so respectfully. And we really talked about it in a way that it was productive, that we can continue and other people can benefit from this. So I'll pass it along back to Lena, and if there's one, I think there's time for one more question or two more questions.
Yeah, like maybe two. I have a question here. Lena, I am wondering what is the best way to respond to our children when they point at minorities and ask questions. For example, why does that woman wear a scarf? Is it awkward? And I am tempted to shush. Is there a better way? I think there is, but I guess that question maybe is going to go to Maryam.
Certainly. I think it's a great moment. I mean, children are the best because they don't have a filter, right? And they cannot hide their emotions, and they're curious. And I understand the incentive or the instinct to just shush them because it's awkward as adults. We're like, we don't want an awkward situation. We don't want the other person to feel like they're being pointed at or anything like that. However, for the sake of the child, it's best to, if you have the information, share with them. If you know why, for example, a person who looks like me has a scarf on, has a hijab on, it would be a great opportunity for you to tell your child, well, they do it for religious reasons. That's great. If you do not know, and I understand, and that's normal. A lot of us don't know why a certain person decides to wear something on their head or lack thereof. So it would be a great opportunity or a chance to eliminate that curiosity, in the sense that you're not alienating them from that person by just saying, hey, my child here has a question. Would you mind answering it? I'm sorry, I don't know the answer, and I wouldn't want to give them the wrong answer. So would you mind? You might you might end up with a person that doesn't like to talk, or maybe they don't feel comfortable speaking, or maybe they don't have the language skills to talk to you, but you're likely going to end up with a person that can. And you won't believe the friendship that it might come out of that, or that feeling that a person acknowledged their appearance and was wondering about them, that sense of, I matter. Somebody was wondering why I choose to do something. That gives them the benefit of that you took the time to talk to that person and ask them that question. I know it's awkward. I know it's uncomfortable. And I know it's our instinct as humans. We avoid conflict, and we avoid getting in an awkward situation. But sometimes uncomfortable things lead to an amazing thing. So I think, personally, this is just my opinion, it will be a good education moment to tell our children to ask and to be okay to ask and get to know the others, rather than avoid it and treat it as something foreign.
Maybe I don't know if Maryam, like if someone has more questions, specific questions, because we don't want to end up like having it as a like not a religious or something related to something specific. If people can reach out to you and the other panelists as well, like Matthew and Amanda, if someone maybe have a direct question, a specific question to you later on, if you guys are okay, just let me know and I'll put your contact information if you are. But
yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Someone that had an issue in Fredericton, and it's a case of a minority that was robbed, and then he reported the case to the police, and nothing was done. Apparently, the person reached out to me, asking me if I know a lawyer that the guy really wanted to take up the case. He was robbed the first time. He identified the case. He identified the people, and then he reported to the police. Nothing was done. And also recently, his apartment was also vandalized again. This time around, he wasn't around. This happened. And then he began to like question at what point does the police get involved? And then he began to say, is it because I'm not a Canadian that I've got rights and all that? You know, sometimes when things doesn't get done, it becomes an issue, like an unanswered question that you begin to question yourself, you begin to ask yourself. So that is one thought that I really would love us to look at. The second thing I wanted to talk about is the case of children, you know, children of minority, children with, you know, different skin color at school, having other children, being careful not to relate with them, having other children referring to the color of their skin as poop and all that. You know, it's psychological. It makes such children not wanting to go to school. It makes them to like begin to say, I don't think I belong here. It makes them to start wondering if they are pretty much a second-class citizen psychologically. So those are the things that I believe that education, enlightenment programs on over the radio, schools can actually go a long way in helping to shape these children, because children are the future of tomorrow. How we make them to understand diversity, acceptance goes a long way. That's number two. And I can still speak to you. I was speaking to my child about 2 hours ago. But every day, one of my children, every day I ask them, what's going on at school? This and that. And they tell me they still prefer the school at the North End than where we are today. You know why? Because we have children of international students, we have children of other lecturers that are not all full Canadians. Do you understand what I'm trying to do? So there is still a bit of diversity. They can still relate to things. Where they are right now, the same cannot be said of that. One of them told me today that anytime he goes towards their friends, like, okay, you see them talking, he wants to talk to them. And the moment he gets there, they stop talking and they tell him they're not talking anything. So I just believe that we need to do a lot. There are a lot that needs to be done. I know that Saint John, New Brunswick, we're doing great in terms of how we like bring up programs out there. We relate to ourselves, very nice people around. But there are still some things that is still systemic that we need to look beyond just saying, oh, we're accommodating, we're friendly. Charity begins at home, they say. We need to be able to like get our children. Like the answer that Lena gave to Sarah's question really is really a great way to start. They're able to know that these people, they are from certain culture, and when they understand their culture, when they understand how and why they use hijabs or scarves, they can relate more. And when they know that, they also pass on the message to their generation. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. That's a very good point. So just to be mindful of the time, does anyone have any final comment to Bob, if you have something to say, or one of the panelists, just to...
No, my only comment is that this was an idea that we had. We're very much aware that it was an experiment. The point was to try doing it, because the worst thing to do is not doing it, and learning from it. So if there are suggestions, comments about how we can do this again, how we can do it better, then all of that would help, because again, if it's going to be a conversation, it needs to be ongoing, and we need to learn. But hopefully what will happen is that this will just continue, and not only will we, Newcomers Center, but there's no reason that other people everywhere, in one sense, can't do the same thing. I mean, in one sense, this was pretty easy to do.
Absolutely.
So there's nothing to stop all kinds of other people and groups from doing that on their own.
Absolutely.
Spread.
Yeah, and we actually encourage people to do that. It's just not talking about an issue is never going to solve. We might not solve everything, you know, in 1 or 2 or 100 talks, but we will have a huge improvement and impact on the whole community for sure.
And I did have a suggestion for how to educate the children. I think, and also for the adults also. Is like it is good to watch international news, so we know about other countries, and this is a good opportunity to see other people with different skin color, different religions. And also, if you have the opportunity to, if you have friends of other cultures, ask them how they celebrate their festivals, their language, their countries. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
So I'm born and raised in Saint John, New Brunswick, and I work at a finance company that's here, and I hire a lot of people who are newcomers, who have immigrated over. And one of the struggles that I have is educating my other employees who are white on how to respect their religions and their beliefs. Do you have any suggestions or programs in which I could maybe bring someone in to talk to my workers on how to have that kind of discussion and how to be respectful? Like, they might not celebrate Christmas. Like, their New Year's might be at a different time of year other than January 1st.
I so have the solution for you, Madame, and others. It's part of recognizing diverse workforce, recognizing different holidays. For example, if you hire someone who's Muslim, it's appropriate for them to have Friday off, and just different things like that. And to recognize different holidays. Also having a buddy system when that person is first hired, to make sure that they are integrating into the culture of the company, and that the people in the company are understanding everything about that new person, whether they're a newcomer or an old comer or whatever you'd like to say.
We actually offer cultural competency training for years. We've been doing that now for lots of employers, and also, I mean, just reach out and I'll give you more information on it. And if anyone else is interested for their workplace, let us know. We can definitely work with you and help with that for sure. Thank you so much, you guys. I really, really appreciate you being here. And please send us any messages, any comments, any input. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Bob, for doing this today. You were absolutely awesome. Thank you.
You have been listening to Radicalized Podcast 506 by the Saint John Newcomers Center. A huge thank you to our listeners and a huge thank you to our guests, Maryam Nasser, Matthew Martin, and Amanda Leblanc, for sharing their stories. It is very important to bring awareness to anti-racism because everyone has the right to be treated equally. Don't forget to join us next week for another episode with our next guests. You may visit our website, www.sjmnrc.com, for bonus content. Until next time.